Hey folks, Andy Patton here with another episode in our season in review series, talking all things Anton Watson today. A look at his third season with the Zags, reviewing how he performed compared to the best and worst case scenarios we laid out for him before the season, and a look at what his role is going to look like next year, what that means for the Zags, all right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. I also want to thank all of you who continue to make Locked On Zags your first listen every day. And for those of you who have continued to check the show out on YouTube, if you have not done so yet, just go to youtube.com, search Locked On Zags. You can find all of the episodes there. You can find them organized by the specific type of episode that they are. You can hit that subscribe button to be one of the next subscribers to the show. Today is, I believe, the 10th episode in our series reviewing every player on Gonzaga's roster. We're talking about how their season went. We're comparing them to the best and worst case scenarios that I laid out for them before the season began. And then we're talking about each player's future, whether they're coming back to Gonzaga, whether they're not, and what it means for the team today. We're talking about the Spokane native, the man from Gonzaga Prep. He was a Bull Pop. Now he's a Bulldog. That is, of course, Anton Watson. Watson committed to the Zags way back in 2017. It feels like he's been around for a long time because he's been around for a very long time. Like we said, a Spokane native, so he didn't have to move all that far to show up on Gonzaga's campus. Maybe not everybody remembers this, but he was the top 50 recruit in the class. According to 24/7 Sports, he was the number 2 ranked player in the state of Washington behind Jaden McDaniels, who is now in the NBA after going to the University of Washington. Watson played somewhat sparingly as a freshman. He had a big role early in the year, started to begin his college career. That shoulder injury just lingered, and eventually he had season-ending shoulder surgery to cut short his freshman year. That injury impacted him a fair amount as a sophomore as well. He did play 32 games for the Zags in his second season, made 17 starts, played roughly 18 minutes per game. His numbers were solid. He kind of faded as the year went on. He lost his starting job to Andrew Nembhard, who eventually ended up filling out a 3-guard lineup for the Zags, but he still had a very solid sophomore year. And there was some kind of question of what his role was going to look like this year as a junior with Chet Holmgren, with Timmy. Were they going to play a lot of 3 big lineups, which was something we kind of talked a lot about before the season started, kind of where was his role going to be. He ended up having probably the most clearly defined role of his 3-year collegiate career as a junior. His first 2 seasons, he started some games, didn't start some other games. His role kind of changed as the year went on. This year, it was ironclad. From the first game to the last game, Anton Watson was very clearly this team's 3rd big. He was the first player coming off of the bench. He played a very consistent number of minutes per game, and I think the consistency really helped him. Certainly, we know that Mark Few is a bit of he kind of falls victim to being really, really tight with his rotations in terms of just how many players that he plays, and also just getting a little repetitive and doing the same things, doesn't switch it up all of that often. There are a handful of things that I think are worthy to criticize Mark Few for, and I think being pretty unwilling to adapt his lineups is one of them. But I do think that in a lot of situations, it can really help the players, particularly players who haven't had that kind of consistency in their career up to this point. So for Anton Watson, he played 18 minutes per game. He was the first guy coming off the bench. His role was very, very, very similar pretty much every single game. He finished the year averaging 7.3 points, 4.7 rebounds, 1.9 assists, and 1.3 steals per game. Every single one of those is a career high. And yes, you might say, well, he played more minutes. Of course, he played about about 1 minute more per game this year than he did last year. So it was a pretty minute difference in terms of minutes. Obviously, last year, like we said, he played more at the beginning of the year and that faded. This year, a bit more consistent, but still for him to put up career highs in basically every major statistical category is pretty significant. He finished the year with a 53.8 field goal percentage. He was at just under 59% on 2-pointers, which is great, but it is also a very big fall from where he was as a sophomore. His sophomore year, Watson scored 71% of the time when he was taking 2-point shots. That is an incredible number. So for this year, for it to fall to 59, which is still really, really good, it looks like a pretty big fall. But still, for Watson, he's not an elite scorer. He's certainly not a high volume scorer the way that Drew Timme or Brandon Clark were. But for him to be scoring around 59% of the time on 2-point shots is dang impressive. It's something that he deserves more credit for than I think he gets by a lot of people. However, Watson doesn't do a whole lot else on offense. This season was a career best 22.7% from deep. That's just not getting it done. He's not an outside shooter. He has fortunately not attempted to really be an outside shooter. He took more threes this year than he had in his first 2 seasons, but he's still attempting not even 1 3 per game. This is not a huge part of his game. It would be really nice, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in each of the next 2 segments, but it would be nice if Watson could really stretch the defense a little bit, play more away from the rim, because right now, offensively, he's best utilized as a low post scorer, and Gonzaga has frequently had those on the roster and hasn't really needed him to fill that role. Now, when he needs to come into the game in place of Drew Timme and is utilized as a low post scorer when Timmy was on the bench, that worked pretty well, and it was something he was capable of doing. But he doesn't have a lot of offensive versatility outside of that, and it is something that has hampered his ability in terms of just developing, in terms of being an NBA prospect, and really in terms of kind of helping the Zags out of some certain situations. He did improve his free throw percentage up just under 70%, 69.8. That's not elite by any means, but it is a big improvement from each of his last 2 seasons. 70% free throw shooter is far from the worst. It was nice to see that be an area of improvement for him, especially with the outside shooting woes still being an issue. Now, consistency is a big question with Anton Watson. It was a question about him last year. It was a question coming into this year. And frankly, it's still a little bit of a question. He kind of had 3 seasons in a sense. He had his first 8 games, the middle 16 games, and then his final 8 games. And I broke those out into 3 different categories. And you can see the pretty significant difference in his performances. In the first 8 games of the season, Anton Watson averaged 3.6 points per game. Along with 3.5 rebounds, 2.6 assists, he shot just under 42% from the field, and he took 5 3-pointers in those 8 games and made 0 of them. In his next 16 games, this is where Watson really started to thrive. This was the best version of Anton Watson that we saw. 16 games in the middle of the season, he averaged 11 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists. He shot 61.5% from the field, and he took 14 3-pointers in those 16 games, and he knocked down 5 of them. That's good for 36%. So for half of the season, the middle portion of the season, Anton Watson was a 36% 3-point shooter. This is on 14 attempts, so we're not talking about somebody who's like burning the nets or anything, but I thought it was notable that for a huge chunk of the season, he actually wasn't that bad of an outside shooter, and he was averaging 11 and 5 coming off the bench, 11 and 5 with 2 assists coming off the bench. This was a really excellent stretch. And it's, we're not talking about a 3 or 4 game stretch. This is half the season that Anton Watson performed at this level. And then in the final 8 games, the third segment of the season, Watson averaged 4 points, 5.5 rebounds, 1.3 assists. His field goal percentage was below 40% during those final 8 games, and he took 3 3-point attempts and did not make any of them. So 0 for 8 from 3 in his first and last 8 games of the season, 5 for 14 in the middle of that. Just kind of an interesting dynamic for Watson. You could make some arguments that fatigue was a factor at the end of the year. It seems to impact a lot of Gonzaga's players. You could make the argument that he was still finding his role at the beginning of the year. There are a lot of ways to interpret this data. None of them are necessarily 100% accurate. Some of it is probably just a little bit fluky, a little bit arbitrary, whatever it is. But one argument that I have seen a lot, that many of you are listening have either heard or have parroted yourself, is that Watson only plays well against good or against bad teams. And then if you look at, in the middle of the season, that's when Gonzaga was playing all of the bad WCC teams. That must be the case. It's not. It's not. This is a false narrative. Certainly some of Anton Watson's best games have been against bad teams. That's true of everybody. That's a little bit unfair to just put that on Anton Watson. Chet Holmgren's career high game against the University of San Diego. This is just Gonzaga plays a lot of bad teams. It's a part of how their schedule works because they're still in the WCC. And even outside of that, they play bad teams in a non-conference. That's just, they play a lot of bad teams. And so for Watson, he doesn't have this consistent trend of not playing well against good teams and only playing well against bad teams. That's just not the case. A couple examples in this season, he had 10 points and 4 rebounds on perfect 4 of 4 shooting against Alabama. He was dang near the only player on Gonzaga's roster who played well in Seattle for that one. 10 points, 4 boards, 2 steals against Texas Tech. In that game, he went 3 for 4 from the field and knocked down his only 3-point attempt, as against was arguably considered one of the 5 best defenses in the entire country. And Watson went 10-4 in that one. 10-5 on 5 of 6 shooting against St. Mary's. That was in the WCC championship game after Gonzaga got beat pretty badly by the Gales in the regular season finale, for them to come around and beat St. Mary's in the WCC title game, and for Watson to be one of the biggest pieces, 5 for 6 in that game. So I really just kind of wanted to spend the last minute of this segment kind of poo-pooing a little bit on that idea that Watson only does well against bad teams. He plays better against bad teams, but everybody who has pretty much ever put on a Gonzaga uniform has had some of their best games against the worst teams in the WCC. This is not uncommon and not an argument that should be used solely against Anton Watson. All right, that is an overview of Watson's third season in a Gonzaga uniform. We're going to look back at the best and worst case scenarios for Anton that I laid out before the season started in the second segment. Before we get there, though, let's talk about Built Bar. This is the time of the year that I've pretty much given up on all of my New Year's resolutions, but not this year. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not really a resolution because I actually enjoy eating them. Have you tried the Puffs? If you haven't, you're missing out on one of Built Bar's best tasting bars. Puffs are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy, they're not just a protein bar, they're a treat. And they're covered in 100% real chocolate. In fact, all Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. A typical candy bar can be anywhere from 200 to 300 calories. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. They have mint brownie, coconut almond, and, new for this month, white chocolate cookies and cream. They are all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags, still talking all things Anton Watson in the 10th episode of our season in review series. Second segment, we always look back to October of 2021 when I released my best and worst case scenario predictions for each player on the roster. We're going to look back at those and we're going to discuss where Watson kind of fell. Did he lean best case? Did he lean worst case? Was he somewhere in the middle, and what that kind of means for him going forward? So October 2021, Andy said the best case for Anton Watson is that he is the first player off the bench and he plays 20 to 25 minutes per night. So he didn't quite get up to 20 to 25 minutes per night, in part because at the time I thought that there was a likelihood that we would see some 3 big lineups with Chet Holmgren or Anton Watson playing more of a wing role. Never ended up seeing that. Still, he averaged just under 19 minutes a game. So this was pretty close. And I think with very few exceptions, I think Watson was the first player off the bench basically every single game. That was very clearly his defined role as a junior this season. Best case scenario for Anton Watson, he is a defensive stopper and in contention for WCC Defensive Player of the Year. There was nobody in contention for Defensive Player of the Year that was not named Chet Holmgren, so I don't know that you can really give him that, but he was phenomenal this year defensively. His D rating this season was 86. That means he gave up 86 points per 100 possessions. The only player on Gonzaga's roster who was better than that was Chet Holmgren, and nobody else was particularly close. Anton Watson was a phenomenal defensive player this year. seeing how good of a defensive player somebody is can be difficult. It's not as easy of a thing to watch as a really good scorer or a really good three-point shooter, for example. But make no mistake, Anton Watson is exceptional on the defensive end of the floor. He's good away from the rim. He's not a great rim protector. That's not really what he's been asked to do, but he is a great, great defensive player, and he proved it again this year. Best case scenario for Anton Watson, he's less inconsistent. He averages 8 to 10 points per game by scoring 8 to 10 points per game most nights. Yes, we didn't quite get here on this. I was really hoping that the 8 to 10 points per game is definitely right around where he was. He was a little above that, but he wasn't super consistent. We'd see some 16-point games, some 14, 18-point games. Then we'd see some 3-point games, some 4-point games, some games where he didn't score at all and he had 4 fouls. Like he hasn't quite. And this year, because he had such a consistent role, it was unfortunate to not see him be as consistent. You all know who listen to this podcast that I'm a big Anton Watson supporter and a truther of his, but this consistency thing is an issue for him. It is frustrating to play a guy the same number of minutes basically every game, and to have him come in at the same time, like play the same role, and sometimes he's going to give you 12 and 15, and sometimes he's going to give you 4. And this happens to every player. Drew Timme didn't give Gonzaga 19 points every single game. Sometimes he was better, sometimes he was worse. So it's not fair to levy this only on Watson, but it would be nice to see him be a little bit more consistent. I think that's something Gonzaga could have really utilized this year, especially because they didn't have a lot of help in the front court behind him. Best case scenario for Anton Watson is he becomes a competent three-point shooter and makes the defense respect him. Yeah, he just didn't get there. Again, the middle 16 games of the season when he shot 36%, that was awesome. And I think there were periods of time where defenders were really worried about him and were coming out on him a little bit. But again, that was 14 3-point attempts in 16 games. So it's not like which is fine. I don't think it should have been a bigger part of his game. I think that would have probably had an adverse effect if he was taking too many of them. But he hasn't gotten to the point where defenses are really respecting his outside shot. The best case scenario for Anton Watson is he remains an elite finisher inside and ups his free throw percentage. So the free throw percentage came up. We talked about that a little bit in the first segment. That was a best case scenario come true for Anton Watson, but remaining an elite finisher inside, again, 59% on 2-pointers is pretty dang good. You could make a strong argument that is elite. But considering he was 71% as a sophomore and he dropped 12 percentage points, I'm not sure that we can call that a best case scenario. The hope was that he would at least maintain or be in the mid 60s on those 2-point shots. 59, while not bad, is still a pretty sharp decline from where he was as a sophomore. Best case scenario for Anton Watson, he's playable with both Timmy and Chet and helps ease the defensive burden on everyone. So yeah, he was the backup to both spots. He played alongside Chet Holmgren. He played alongside Drew Timme. Very comfortable playing with both of them, which was huge. Gonzaga really wanted to be able to just rotate those 3 guys in and get 40 minutes at 2 spots out of just those 3 guys. And they were able to do so with a ton of success this season because Watson was flexible, because he can play defense away from the rim, because he can adequately handle himself down low if needed. Most of the time he wasn't, asked to be the primary rim protector, but if he was guarding a guy who was trying to post him up, he's a good enough defensive player that he was able to do that. And then finally, the last best case scenario for Mr. Watson, it's at least talked about that he could leave early to play pro ball. No, this is not really being discussed. We'll talk about it more in the third segment, but Anton Watson's coming back. He's got at least 1 more year in a Gonzaga uniform, potentially 2, depending on what he wants to do. But there's not really any conversation right now about him being a professional basketball player, at least not before next season. All right, worst case scenarios for Anton Watson. The worst case scenario is that his outside shooting is not consistent, but he keeps shooting them. This was kind of the fear, is that with Watson and a little bit with Drew Timme, is like these are guys who are going to want to take a lot of threes because they have NBA aspirations. And that's one thing you need to display that you're capable of doing in the NBA, but that they just weren't going to knock them down. Now, Mark Few is a very good coach, and he has been very good at not allowing guys to do stuff like this, I guess is the best way to put it. Watson slightly improved as a 3-point shooter. He was still under 23% on the season, which is pretty darn bad, but he also only took like 3/4 of 1 attempt per game. I think he averaged 0.7 per game. So it wasn't happening enough for it to be really a positive or a negative thing for Gonzaga this season. Worst case scenario for Anton Watson, the free throw shooting doesn't improve and he is a late game liability. So again, up to 70% on the free throws, right around the same as Drew Timme. So he didn't make himself a liability on that end. He wasn't really on the floor a lot in late game situations unless there was foul trouble for either Drew Timme or Chet Holmgren. But offensively, he wasn't going to be, you didn't want him on the floor even if the free throw percentage ticked up. He was just so good defensively that you want to try to get him in at least on that end of the floor when you can. Worst case scenario for Anton Watson, it was hard to play alongside Chet and Drew, and he can only play if one sits. Yeah, so this was absolutely the case. I don't think it ended up actually being a worst case scenario, really, but he never played with both. I don't think these three guys played a single minute all together on the court at the same time. I don't think that it ever happened. But Watson was clearly ahead of both Ben Gregg and Caden Perry when they were healthy, that he soaked up every minute that basically either Drew or Chet were not on the floor. Worst case scenario for Anton Watson is he loses playing time to either Ben Gregg or Caden Perry, and this did not happen. It's impossible to know what would have happened had Caden Perry stayed fully healthy for the entire season. I suspect that he certainly would have played as the year went on, but I don't think he was going to cut seriously into Anton Watson's minutes. I think the staff really liked what they got out of Anton this year on both ends of the floor, and I just don't think Perry would have. I think there's a chance he could cut into some of his minutes next season, and we'll talk about that in the third segment, but I don't think that it would have happened this past year. Worst case scenario for Anton Watson is that he has an undefined role heading into his senior year, and that is what I want to talk about in the third segment. At this point in late April, his role is not clearly defined, but that is more to do with the fact that Gonzaga's roster is pretty undefined and less to do with Anton Watson and his skill set. But we're going to come back in the third segment. We're going to talk about what the Zags are going to do with Anton Watson next season. Before we get there, though, let's talk about Rock Auto. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing number of makes and models, it is now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning like, is your Odyssey an LX or an EX, and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Plus, Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you could need. Brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpets. I just had my 13-year-old car serviced recently, and I can tell you, having one place to find all the parts I needed made things infinitely easier. So go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. That's rockauto.com. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags, still talking all things Spokane native Anton Watson. Third segment, we're taking a look at his future, specifically what his role could look like in his fourth season in Spokane with the Zags in 2022-2023. So here is what we know. There's kind of a reason I waited on Anton Watson, because the clarity on his role is so undefined and is not going to be defined until a long time from now, especially with the uncertainty on Gonzaga's roster. The things we know: Chet Holmgren is gone. That is thing number one. We knew that over a year ago. About a year ago is when Chet Holmgren committed to Gonzaga, and I could have told you right then that at this time a year later he would be gone. So that is definitively done. He is not coming back. Drew Timme is the big mystery, the big question mark right now. Drew Timme has declared for the 2022 NBA draft. He posted a note that was a big thank you to Gonzaga, to the fan base, the community, coaches, whatever, etc. But he hired an NCAA-approved agent, so he has until mid-June to make the decision to withdraw from the NBA draft, return to Gonzaga, and play another season in Spokane. So I have speculated on this podcast numerous times. I think at this point I'm leaning more likely that he's not returning, but Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky just came back, and he's got a somewhat similar profile to Drew. I think he could come back. I think it makes some sense for him to come back. I think there are also plenty of reasons that make sense for him to not come back. So I'm still kind of 50-50 on him right now. But until we know what Drew Timme is doing, and until we know what, if any, transfer big man the Zags are going to land this offseason, Anton Watson's role is very, very up in the air heading into next season. The nice thing is, while there are some consistency issues with Anton Watson on a day in, day out basis, for the course of a full season, you pretty much know what you're going to get out of him. He's a good rebounder. He's a good passer. For large chunks of the season, he was second on this team in assists. Early in the year in particular, he was a very deft passer, very, very good at that. So he's an adequate offensive player. He's a decent playmaker. He's a good low post scorer. He's not an outside shooter, and he's a great perimeter defensive player. He's great in half-court traps. He's great on the perimeter. He's a very switchable big man. You can put him, if he needs to switch onto a guard, he's very capable of that. So you kind of know what his strengths and weaknesses are. So you kind of know what to plug and play with him that's going to make the most sense. Drew Timme and Anton Watson have played a whole bunch of minutes together in the front court. So if Drew Timme returns, I still think that the Zags are going to go out and get a high-profile transfer big man. They're in on Dawes Amack from Utah Valley. We've talked about him a bunch on this podcast. They're in on Johnny Broome from Morehead State, another guy we've talked about a lot on this podcast. Efton Reed from LSU, somebody I talked about for Mailbag Monday. Those are just a few of the names of big men that Gonzaga is very interested in trying to put on this roster next season. Any of those players would start. Reed is a bit of a question mark, I should say, but Broome or Amack would start over Anton Watson in a heartbeat. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Those guys are really, really good. And Watson coming back as the third big once again and playing a similar role would be excellent. If it was Efton Reed that they added, or if for some reason they were unable to add a high-profile transfer and instead either didn't add one at all and just relied on Ben Gregg, Caden Perry, Braden Huff, or added somebody who's not going to be a big contributor in year one, then I think that the Zags would be pretty comfortable with Watson starting alongside Timmy. It's maybe not ideal, especially if they just don't add anybody and it's Watson and Timmy with Gregg, Perry, Huff as your backups, because there's just not a lot of experience there. There's not a lot of, it's just a big question mark. Caden Perry coming off the significant back injury. It's hard to know when he's going to be 100%. Ben Gregg has not looked good on the defensive end of the floor. He's got some offensive upside, but hasn't showed it yet. Braden Huff, true freshman, just hard to know exactly what he's going to give you. So I think that the Zags are going to add a front court player to this roster. I think if Drew Timme leaves, they're definitely going to add a front court player. They're very realistically could add two in that situation. But I also think it's possible that if Drew Timme leaves and the Zags can go get themselves Dawes Amack or Johnny Broome, that they would start Watson alongside those two guys. It's not necessarily a perfect fit for either of them, and I'm not going to go into too granular with either of them. If one of them shows up on campus, we'll have a much longer conversation about how that front court could match up. Broome is a great low post scorer, but is not a threat whatsoever from the outside. So if Broome and Watson is your primary starting front court, you really need some shooters around them, because those two guys are not going to stretch the floor. You probably don't get to utilize the high-low offense, which is a big part of Gonzaga's success over the past couple of decades, and something they weren't able to use when Anton Watson was the primary four on the 2020-2021 team. So, but if it's Amack's a 44% three-point shooter. He could play more away from the rim. He could feed the ball to Anton Watson, who becomes more of your primary low-post scorer. He's not going to be utilized the same way Drew Timme was utilized, because he's just not that good of a high-volume scorer. But you could at least run sets where Watson's the guy posting up, Amack's away from the rim, pulls the defenders away, allows them more room to operate. There's some options in there. There's some things that I think Gonzaga is capable of doing. I think having 3 years of data on who Anton Watson is, what kind of player he is, what are his strengths, what are his weaknesses, certainly allows Gonzaga more ability to kind of find the right player on the transfer portal who might fit alongside of him. But again, none of this can be concretely answered until we know what the heck is going on with Drew Timme, because his return changes everything. So that's kind of why Gonzaga is in a bit of a holding pattern. Hopefully that will get resolved in some way or another fairly soon. Hopefully they'll at least get some resolution on the transfer portal, and then they can start working on putting those pieces together. The last thing I want to talk about with Anton Watson is the NBA future. I have mentioned on this show a handful of times that I believe he has NBA potential. I still believe in that potential, but there's no denying that at this point, his body of work has not been enough for him to get the attention of NBA scouts, notably the outside shooting. There's a such thing as a 3-and-D wing in the NBA, and it's a very popular position. It is the label that Julian Strother has been receiving throughout his sophomore season, the reason that he's testing the draft waters. But you have to be able to hit that outside shot. Anton Watson could play defense capably in the NBA right now. He wouldn't be as elite in the NBA as he is in college. Most players are not. And the physicality would be a bit of a challenge for him. But he could capably play defense in the NBA right now. I really, truly believe that. But he would be a complete non-factor on offense. If you can't shoot, if you're 6'8" and you can't shoot, you're not going to make it in the NBA. It's just not going to happen. So it's 100% dependent on this. I don't know that he'll ever get the opportunity to be a knockdown 3-point shooter at Gonzaga. It probably would have needed to happen by now. So I don't know where that leaves him. He's coming back for next season. There's a fairly good chance he uses that COVID year and comes back for a 5th year as well. It's way too early to make any concrete predictions about that, but I can tell you right now that it certainly wouldn't shock me if he makes that decision. I'm still holding out hope that the athleticism, the talent on defense, the continued improvement in terms of his basketball intelligence, his high IQ, all of that stuff will help him potentially carve out a professional basketball playing career. But unless he starts knocking down threes at a really high rate, that's probably not something that's in the cards for him going forward. All right, that is going to do it for me today. We got one more of these coming up on Friday. We also got a look at Gonzaga's baseball program, some other transfer portal updates, and rumors on the recruiting trail for Thursday's show right here on the Locked On Zags podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube as well. Finally, thank you again to those of you who have made Locked On Zags your first listen of the day. Now is a great time to make your second listen Locked On NBA Draft podcast. With the college basketball season wrapped up, give Rafael Barlow and a flurry of guests a listen as they prepare for the NBA draft. Hear thoughts on Chet, Holmgren, Paolo Banchero, and the rest of the NBA's future stars on Locked On NBA Draft, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, thank you all for listening, and go Zags.